Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Today is Wednesday, March 18th, 2020. We're about a day ahead of you, so you might be actually watching this on March 17th. It's 4:30 in the afternoon here in China. Today we're going to be talking about two things. The first is this idea of exponential growth, and the second is a term you may have heard. It's been on the news quite a bit there and on different videos here on YouTube. The second thing is flattening the curve. What does that mean? And how can we help to flatten the curve? Why is it so important? Well, let's talk about first exponential growth. And I want to introduce this idea, if you're not familiar with the term of exponents or exponential growth, with a bit of a riddle, a brain teaser. Imagine that you had a wealthy friend that had a fortune that he wanted to share with you. And he gave you two options to receive a part of his fortune. The first option is that he would give you outright $1 million. The second option is that he would give you $1. He'd put it in a bank account in your name, and every day that dollar would multiply by 2. It would double every single day for 25 days. Now, which option should you take? Should you take the $1 million outright, or should you take the $1 that would double for 25 days? Well, what would you end up with? Which option would give you more money in the end? Well, if you went with the first option, you'd get $1 million, but if you went with the second option, you'd actually end up with $16.7 million, so 16 times more than the first option. So the thing about these exponential growth, the idea of exponential growth, things growing at a faster and faster rate over time, is that our brains tend to not quite grasp how quickly those numbers can change, because when it starts off, it's very slow, right? $1 on the first day, $2 on the second day, $4, $8, $16. It doesn't seem like that much, but then suddenly, then it gets to 100, and then 200, 100,000, 200,000, it starts multiplying very, very quickly. And the reason that our brains can't understand this is that we tend to think in patterns. We think in linear shapes. So for example, if I told you that last month in a certain country, 30 people got sick with the COVID-19, your brain would probably calculate, okay, 30 people, there's 30 days in a month, so that means that on average, one person got sick every day. And the average might be right. Maybe that was one person a day, but it really wouldn't be a reflection of reality. More likely, given what we know about this disease, 15 of those people would have gotten sick in the last few days. A week before that, a fourth of the people would have gotten sick, and then for the first 2 weeks, maybe just one person every few days. That's the way this disease spreads. It's growing exponentially. So there's a lot of people that, when they look at the current numbers, they don't seem very worried. They say, well, the US only has 6,500 cases. It only has about 100 deaths. Why is everyone freaking out? This is just the flu. We keep hearing this. Even now, some of our friends that we know are making light of the situation, or saying things like this. It's just a bad cold. Why is everyone freaking out? Why are countries shutting down? Not quite grasping the situation. And it's true that the numbers are currently where they stand. The US has 6,500 cases. There are only 120 deaths. We say only, but those are 120 people that are dead now. We have to remember that. But think of what the numbers were just a week ago. 1 week ago, there were only 1,000 cases. So there are 6,500 now. A week ago, 7 days, was 1,000 cases and only 40 deaths. So really, we've seen quite a growth in just the last week. Now, it's very important when we talk about these numbers not to just pick a point, right, out of time and say, this is how many cases there were today, this is how many deaths. We really have to look at that function, that curve over time, what the exponential growth is telling us. So let's take a look now at the graph that shows us the actual cases day by day in the United States. So here, I like using this site a lot. This is a Worldometer site, and currently we're at 6,500 cases here, 116 deaths. And when we go down to the graph here of the cases, we can see this really, really sharp curve. So about a month ago, there on February 15th, only 15 cases. And the next day, still 15 cases. And for a while, it was at 15, then it jumped up to 35 and 50, but still nothing to really raise a whole lot of alarms about. But then suddenly here, it starts jumping into the hundreds, 700, 900, 1,000, and here we are today at 6.4 thousand. So that number we saw at the top of the screen has not been updated yet on this chart. Remember, they only put a point on the graph every day, so we haven't seen that new point. So very, very quickly, these numbers are going up. And deaths are the same. They're growing exponentially. You can see this curve just picking up and very, very quickly getting us into the hundreds. Now, the thing about these exponential curves or exponential functions is you can graph them, and you can also predict their growth over time. Now, something that's very interesting about the US growth of these confirmed cases, and we want to make that clear, we're talking about confirmed cases. We're not talking about everyone who's sick, because we know there are many, many more sick than the confirmed cases, because many people aren't getting tested and there aren't enough tests to go around. So we're looking at is just confirmed cases. But when we look at those confirmed cases, we see that there's a very, very clear number that stands out. So let's go back to the graph and I'll show you what that number is. So here in our current cases, our confirmed cases, we find that when we compare day-to-day points for the last 2 weeks, the numbers are doubling every 2.5 days. So, for example, here on May 10th, it was about 950, we could say about 1,000 cases. So that means in 2.5 days, it should be about 2,000 cases, right? So if you go 1 day, 2 day, this is 1,600, and this one is 2,100. Between these two, it's about right. That's about 1,800 cases. Let's try another point. This one is 2,157. We say about 2,000 cases there on March 13th. So going ahead 2.5 days should be about 4,000 cases. 1, 2, and then a half. And that's what we find again. Here's 3,500, here's 4,500. So that point in the middle will be 4,000 cases. So no matter what points you pick on the graph, you find this very, very steady and predictable rate of doubling every 2.5 days. So if we project that now into the future, what numbers do we come up with? They are pretty scary. I'm warning you here, and I'm also warning you that we can't say definitively this is exactly what's going to happen, but pretty accurately now, given this data, we can start to predict what's going to happen. So let's take a look at that chart now. All right, so again, this is a chart of the projections of cases over time for the next 2 weeks. March 17th, this is today, or yesterday for me, but today for many of you, and the last point on the graph, 6,100 cases. So 2.5 days later, March 19th and a half, I just wrote March 19th to 20th, that gives us 12,200 cases. March 22, 24,000 cases. March 24 to 25, 50,000, then 100,000, 200,000, and very quickly now, within about 2 weeks, we're at 1.6 million cases. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might see these numbers and you might be thinking, no, it's not going to get this high because everything is shutting down in America. They're closing schools, they're closing stores. San Francisco and many parts of California are now in this home quarantine, home isolation. And that's true. All that is going to help, but it won't help for 2 weeks. We know that because in China and in Korea and in other countries that took these drastic measures, putting masks on people, telling them not to go out, closing schools, all those things that were done, it took 2 weeks for the numbers to slow down. They continued at that same exponential slope for 2 weeks before they began to level off. Now, why 2 weeks? Well, because again, we know that people can be infected and not show symptoms for 2 weeks. And many people that get infected will then not go to a hospital right away. They will become infected, show symptoms, maybe a cough and a fever, and maybe several days into that infection, they'll then go into a hospital and get tested. So there's this latency between initial exposure and infection, which could have already happened in the last 2 weeks, and then the showing of symptoms and then getting the test. So there's always this lag behind the numbers. So even if you shut everything down there in the US today, every single thing, the numbers would still increase for the next 2 weeks. So we can say with a certain amount of certainty that these numbers are going to follow this curve. Now, what about hospitalizations? Well, we know that from other countries, the data is telling us that 15% of people that get this require hospitalization. So if we take 15% of each of these numbers, what do we get? These are the hospital numbers. So currently, there are about 900 people in the hospital. In another few days, that'll go up to 2,000 and then 3,000. By April 7th, we're going to be at 234,000 people in the hospital. Now, if you recall the last video, I had mentioned that there's this issue with hospital beds. And the projection that was given in the article that I linked to was that the first week of May, the hospital beds will all be filled up. So why is that projection and my projection so different? Well, because I'm using the official data of the number of people that require beds according to the studies that have been done here in China and in Italy. The estimation that person made was much lower. They were saying that I think only 8% or only 10% of people needed hospitalization. So they were going with a much more conservative estimation. This one is looking strictly at the data that we have. Hopefully, it'll be better. Hopefully, most people won't require hospitalization. But if they do, we begin to see that these hospitals are going to be in a much more dire situation than even that article that I linked to in the last video. Now, what about deaths? Well, currently, 1.8% of people in the United States that have gotten this have died. Now, we can't say with finality that that means that only 1.8% of the population that gets sick with this is going to die, because that number will go up. And the reason that we know that number will go up is because many of these cases are new cases that are unresolved. We do not know if they're going to get better. We do not know if they're going to die. So as those cases resolve, then likely we'll begin to see more deaths. But if we use that 1.8% and project now how many of these people will end in death, these are the numbers that we get. So as of today, 116 deaths. Again, that's 1.8% of the total number of 6,000 cases. And if we go to April 7th, we see 29,000 deaths. Now that might be hard to believe because we look at the total deaths around the world and it's about 8,000 right now. So we might be thinking, how is it possible that America will have this many deaths? But in fact, this is a very new pandemic. It's just getting started around the world. So very quickly we've gone from 3,000 deaths now to 8,000 deaths, and in the next couple of days we will likely surpass 15,000 deaths. Those numbers are going up very, very quickly. So America will still be just a small percentage of the global number of deaths. So hopefully looking at these numbers, we begin to see just how serious this situation is. We can't pick out a point on the graph and say, oh, look how small the numbers are. Why are we so scared? Well, we're scared because of the speed of this disease spreading through the population. We're scared because it's so transmissible. We're also scared because the death rate is much higher than the seasonal flu. So let's go on to the next topic of this video, and that is this idea of flattening the curve. What does it mean when these epidemiologists and these health experts, and now in different governments around the world, are saying we need to flatten the curve? Well, let's take a look at this graph and we'll try to explain it. So these two curves represent two ways to tackle an epidemic within a population. The first curve is uncontrolled transmission. That's where you just don't do anything. You don't put any kind of social distancing in place. You don't close schools. You don't tell people to wear masks. You don't tell them to wash their hands. You just let it burn through the population. This is what we get. The numbers go up very, very quickly. Again, this is exponential growth. This is what we're seeing right now and all over the world, with the exception of just a few countries. It's going up very, very, very quickly, and eventually it gets to a point where everyone gets it, and then the number of cases or new cases begins to go down, and either the cases resolve in death or they resolve in recovery. Now, the second way to deal with this kind of an outbreak is to try to put in some measures that are proactive and preventative. You try to get people to social distance. You cancel large sporting events. You cancel unnecessary events outdoors that gather lots and lots of people. You close the schools. You close businesses. You tell people to stay home. All of those things give you a much, much slower curve. Now, we're not there yet, again, because it's going to take 2 weeks to see the curve here in the United States or there in the United States begin to kind of even out. But hopefully, the numbers will go somewhat like this. Now, there are different opinions on either one of these curves. Some countries, including the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, are going for this curve here. They're going for the fast burn. Why would they do that? Well, the idea is that if everyone gets sick as fast as possible, we can develop a herd immunity. We can get it to the point where everyone's got it, we have the antibodies, we don't have to worry about it anymore. The problem with that is it's a very, very risky gamble to take, because once you get beyond this line here, it's beyond the ability of healthcare to care for these people. It's beyond the hospital's available beds, the available ICU rooms, the available respirators to care for people. And in fact, in some countries, this is what's happening. The reports coming out of Italy, reports coming out originally from China, and even there in Iran now, are telling us that the doctors are having to make decisions on who lives and who dies. They're having to decide who gets a respirator and who has to just go home and die, because there just isn't enough healthcare workers, there isn't enough systems in place and rooms in place and beds and these kinds of things to take care of everyone. So this is why this is so risky. Yes, it gets through it faster, and you hope that there are the antibodies that are developed there. You hope that, but we don't know yet that that's going to be the case. So this is a very, very risky endeavor. But some governments feel that this is the fastest way to get through it. It has the least amount of economic turmoil. Because it's so short. It doesn't upset the economy for a very long time. The second curve is going to have a longer disruption time period, and this is what America is now going for. They've decided that they want to social distance. They want to flatten that curve so that not everyone is getting sick at the same time. This allows the healthcare workers, the hospitals, to keep up with the patients coming through the door. So remember, we've said before that if the number of sick people rises too quickly, the healthcare cannot handle them, they cannot take care of them, then the death rate will rise. Now, when I had made that claim before, there were a few people that had written me and a few people that left comments that said, no, that's not going to happen. The death rate's always going to either be level or it's going to go down as people get care. But actually, this is what we see looking at the current data. So if we go back to the Worldometer's main page here, we can take a look at the closed cases. So these are cases, again, that have resolved one way or another. Either they've died or they've been discharged, they've recovered. What we see in this graph is very, very telling. At its lowest point, the mortality rate or the death rate among these closed cases was about 5.7 or about 6%. But in the last week or so, it's gone up to 8.8%, about 9%. So that death rate is going up. And the reason it's going up is because healthcare cannot take care of all these people. So a person that originally may have lived if they had gotten the ICU bed, if they had gotten the respirator, or the ventilator rather, if they had gotten that good care from the doctors and nurses, they would have lived. But now, because there's just too many people, now they're dying. So this is the risk of not flattening the curve. And this is the reason that in many countries, in most countries, they are actively trying to flatten that curve. So what does this all have to do with you? As you know, if you've been watching these videos for a while, I always try to bring it back to the individual viewer that's watching this. What does this all have to do with us? Why do we need to know these things? Well, there's two takeaways, I think, that I want you to think about after watching this video and maybe doing some extra research as well. And the first thing is that because we know what the numbers are going to do, because we know what these projections are telling us, the cases and how they're going to increase so quickly, it empowers us, right? There's a difference between informed fear and sort of a blind dread, right? Dread is the feeling that you get when you come home at night and you're by yourself, you're home alone, and you get into your bedroom and the window's open. And there's a breeze coming through and the curtains are kind of fluttering. And you start thinking, did I leave that window open or did I close it? Dread is the feeling of when you go into your basement and it's dark at night and you see something out of the corner of your eye move in the shadows. That's dread. It's not knowing what you're afraid of, but having this uneasy feeling that begins to turn into panic. That's what we don't want. But an informed fear is the fear that you have when you know a typhoon is about to come. The informed fear is when you hear the sirens go off and a hurricane is about to make landfall. It's the fear that allows you to make good decisions and not panic when these numbers come out. Because the thing is given these projections, given what we know about this disease and the numbers going up, it's very likely that in the next week or so you'll turn on the news and that number will be on the screen. And many people that see it will say, how is this possible? How did the numbers go up so quickly? But knowing the exponential growth of this disease, you'll say, oh yeah, okay, I knew it was going to be like this. It really empowers you and it takes away some of that panic. So again, knowledge is power, is what they say, right? So the more you can learn about the disease, the more you can kind of turn on the lights in that basement and make that fear now turn into something that's manageable. You know exactly what it is to be afraid of and you can kind of take steps to protect yourself. The second thing is this importance of flattening the curve. So now that we know that this is why social distancing is being mandated by so many governments, that's why they're shutting down so many parts of the country, it helps us to support that. It helps us to not grumble about things that we can't do in the past. We can't go to Disneyland or can't go to Disney World or we can't take these vacations we wanted to take. We're disappointed about it, but we realize that by not going, we're helping to flatten the curve. It may be true that we won't get sick, but that doesn't mean that we won't get the virus on our bodies or in our bodies and then give it to someone who will get seriously sick. So when you think about how your life is going to change over the next week and how it's probably changing every single day there, the kids are out of school, you're home with them, you're not able to go out and do the things you want to do, you're not able to go out and see your friends as you want. Just remember that you're helping to flatten the curve. And that's so important because it gives the healthcare workers, it gives the doctors and nurses a fighting chance in these hospitals because they're going to be unimaginably busy in the months and in the weeks to come. So hopefully this was helpful. You may already know this if you're following the news on this, if you've been listening to experts and researchers and especially epidemiologists talking about these things. This won't be the first time you've heard it. But if it is, hopefully it helped. As always, please stay safe, stay healthy, wear a mask if you can, and we'll see you next time.